You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hello, my name is Uwe Schulte, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this podcast in our new series, Let's Talk Sustainable Business, brought to you by the Conference Board Global Sustainability Center. Today, I will be talking with Rosie Hurst from Impact about securing human rights in supply chains. Before we get started, as we are recording this podcast during the COVID-19 crisis, we would like to express our solidarity with all those suffering in this crisis and express our gratitude to all supporting those in need. So first, let me introduce our guest to you. Rosie Hurst is the founder and director of a consultancy with a mission of improving the lives and livelihoods of workers worldwide by using the positive power of global supply chains. Rosie founded SEDEX and the Local Resources Network. She worked with the Airway Foundation, building workers' negotiations capabilities and using techniques derived from social psychology to rehumanize relations in the workplace. Rosie is working with many leading companies and organizations on their human rights programs. She serves on the EcoVadis Technical Committee and is a member of the Responsible Investment Advisory Council at BMO GAM. So, hello, Rosie.
Hi, Uwe. How are you?
Considering the circumstances, I'm fine, and I hope you are safe and healthy as well.
All well here.
Okay, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, that's a very open question, Uwe. But yes, I first started thinking about workers and supply chains. Goodness, it is about 25 years ago now. I was living in India in the mid-90s, at just about the time when India was opening up to foreign direct investment. And it became very clear that as global trade started to increase and as India was exporting more and more, particularly at that time, consumer goods, it became clear that jobs in global supply chains could really help lift workers out of poverty. But it also was very clear that the way the global supply chain works means that the lack of transparency and also just human nature means that quite a lot of the money gets stuck in the middle and at the top, and perhaps not enough money and not enough attention to how people are treated goes through to workers at the bottom. So that got me thinking about how to make global trade work for workers and work for business. So what I did first of all, actually, was thought, I'll go and do a master's in development studies because that'll have the answer. So I went to SOAS, part of the University of London, and actually at that time there was almost nothing on trade. There was an awful lot on investment and a lot on government programs, but very, very little on trade. So I decided to do my dissertation on this topic. But actually, I'm ashamed to say that I have never finished my dissertation because my dissertation turned into impact very rapidly, because what was field work for dissertation actually turned into paid consultancy. And really the rest is history. So that's how impact started. And many apologies for not having a master's in development studies.
Apologies accepted, I should say. That is a given looking at your track record ever since. Okay, let's talk a little bit about human rights. We always use that expression, and it relates back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And at the time, it was adopted by a vast majority of UN member states. And I think the whole thing got so much traction because people were under the shock and dismay about the atrocities of the Nazi German regime. But even then, already different views on this emerged. And so, for example, South Africa didn't sign, not very surprising because apartheid was still in full swing, and Saudi Arabia didn't sign because they didn't approve of freedom of religion, and the Soviet bloc abstained. I'm not quite sure why that was the case, but probably for similar reasons. So even then, things weren't quite as one would like. How do you see this developing?
Yes, I mean this question about whether human rights are truly universal or whether they're some sort of Western or liberal concept is something actually that we get thrown back at us quite often, just in a practical basis, actually. I mean, I think sometimes, I mean, whilst the normative framework is extremely useful, I think it's also quite important to come down from that high theoretical level and just think about people, because that's really what we're talking about when we think about human rights, is actually about the rights of individuals and the responsibilities of individuals. And part of the way that we look at this in the workplace, because obviously we specialize in that aspect of human rights, which is workplace labor rights, is to think about what is it that workers actually want. So what is the deal from the worker's perspective? What would a good job look like? And we've spoken to tens of thousands of workers over the last 25 years, and funnily enough, they have the same answer to this question as you or I would have, Uwe, because this is actually about being a human being. There are three things in general that people want from their jobs. They want money, of course, but interestingly, it's much less about the quantum of money. Even amongst very poor people, it's much more about regularity and predictability. So, like all of us, workers want to be able to plan ahead, and they want to be able to plan their lives according to their budget. So the first thing is money and regularity of income. The second thing is respect. Now, respect, in a way, that sounds like a slightly amorphous concept, but in fact, it's very clear when you talk to workers what they mean by this. They mean two things. They mean, obviously, to be respected in the workplace. So that's about not being shouted at, not being spat at, and all that kind of thing. But it's also about being respected for the job you do. And those of us who work in the professional arena are very familiar with this. You know, when you go to a party or something and you say what you do, people are very interested, and that adds to your social capital. It's just the same for workers. So they want to be able to improve their social capital with their family, with their communities, because of the job they do. So that means working for a respected employer, and also things like, if your employer is respected, maybe it's possible for you to perhaps take a loan till the end of the month from a shopkeeper because your employer is respected. So I think we all recognise that that's a very important part of it. And the third thing is, do workers' jobs help them to give a better life to their families? Now, that is something I think, again, we all recognise, because we all want to be in a job that's on the way to somewhere that is enabling us to help our families and our children to move forward. So if you ask workers what they think about human rights, they won't have a particularly high level of interest, actually. But if you ask them what's important to them, you get those three things. So that's money, respect, and a better life for the family. Now, if we can make the jobs in the world do that, inevitably we respect human rights, because projecting this idea of money, respect, and better life for children means that we actually have to think of those workers as people, and we have to think, what are the types of jobs, what are the types of treatment, what are the types of terms and conditions which deliver those three important things. And before I finish on this, that's a far more tangible thing. It delivers the benefits that workers want, and of course, it has the other benefit of creating a workforce that's motivated. Because of course, if people have jobs which give them what they want, where they feel respected, etc., 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 they're much more likely to be productive, to stay, and bring their brain to work as well as their hands and feet. So, not quite the answer perhaps you had intended, but I hope that helps the conversation along.
It very much does. it raises a number of points, and you make things a lot more tangible, at least in my mind, compared to, you know, a questionnaire with a few boxes to tick. So let's get to that. If I'm responsible for a supply chain in a company, what would you say, taking your concept, what should I be watching and monitoring to secure the adherence to human rights in my supply chain?
Yeah, this is the very, very big question. And of course, over the last 20 years, a lot of sterling and of highly technical work has been done looking at standards, what those standards might mean in practice, how to assess against those standards, whether that's a desk-based questionnaire assessment or whether that is through auditing. And the sad fact is that this has not proven a very good way of identifying the rotten apples. And again, take a step back from all of this, I think the notion of questionnaires and audits is based on the idea that the global supply chain is actually completely fine. And what we need to do is have a few tripwire questions which enable us to pick out the rotten apples, and the rest of the barrel is fine. I think the truth of the matter is, because of different levels of social and economic development, because of local practices, because of ingrained societal discrimination, because of poverty, because of all of these things, many contexts have very challenging issues around labour standards. And any company, actually many of my clients have been in this position, any company that suddenly finds itself in the headlines with a scandal knows this feeling very, very well, because they say, but we checked, and we didn't find it. We've got an audit that shows it's all fine. And yet you go again with new eyes and you find actually that the scandal is probably on average 95% correct. And this is the issue that we find ourselves up against again and again, with companies with egg on their face. It's companies who've tried really hard to find out, and who subsequently find that the thing was staring in the face all along. So the way that we at Impact look at this is to try and get the worker perspective at the centre. Very, very, very many of these problems are caused by a dehumanization. So, whenever you hear an employer, a supplier, anyone say things like, well, you don't understand, it's much, much better here than it is in these people's homes. Or actually, they don't have bathrooms at home, so, they make the place very dirty, they're dirty. Or, do you know these people, they can't learn? And this is something we hear again and again and again. It's a real sign of dehumanization. And of course, the moment you can think that somebody is dirty or somebody can't learn, it's second nature then to start managing them in a way that doesn't deliver money, respect, or indeed a better life for children. So one of the things that we look at is helping companies make decisions and helping individuals in companies make decisions with a rehumanizing lens and identifying risk with that nose for dehumanization. So that means, for example, any context where you have migrant workers is likely to be very high risk of reasonably serious labour rights abuses, because, as we all know, the position of migrants in all societies tends to be a difficult one, and it tends to be that different standards are applied when it comes to managing or governing migrants. So that's one very, very clear risk factor. So our advice is look at the macro risk, because it is most unlikely that your suppliers will magically happen not to be participating in that macro risk. There are some people, I think, who have thought that almost magically, because of the power of their brand name or their own ethics, that somehow their supply chain is immune from these societal issues which are around the world. And it tends to be that blind spot which causes embarrassment in the end. Does that help? I'll go a little tiny way to answering your $1 million question.
Yeah, it does and it doesn't. Let me try to explain
Probe.
why. Um, a lot of people in supply chains, they rely on third-party audits. They say this is fine. And actually, before they do an audit, they usually do a self-assessment questionnaire with the supplier, and they try to spot risk areas and so on and so forth. And prior to that, they probably have identified areas of high risk. And what you're basically saying, that doesn't give you what you want. And what I'm hearing you say, and tell me whether I get this right, is you say, don't just look at that certain boxes are ticked, look at the root causes that prevent your three elements of paying adequately and regularly, giving people respect, and giving them a perspective of their family and their children. Um, Give me a real example how I would do that if I am in charge of my supply chain.
Absolutely. Well, I think the first thing is, as you say, the beginning is looking at that macro risk, and for me, having a strong understanding of who the workers are in those supply chains. So, are they migrants? Are they people from disadvantaged groups? Is the first risk factor. So once one has understood that, then is the question, then is the time to delve in a little bit more deeply. And I think one of the keys is, rather than asking a question like, "Do you pay the minimum wage?" is to find out what the quantum of wages being earned is. So, in other words, rather than saying, "Do you meet this standard?" understanding how much people are actually earning, including overtime, with some background knowledge of what helps people to get by, gives you an idea about whether those jobs are meeting that first category. So a standard audit looks at, are you complying with minimum wage legislation? Tick. Are you compliant? Do you have a policy on discrimination? Tick. Etc. 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 That doesn't break through into workers' experience. What I think needs to be done is the sort of investigation that puts the worker experience at the centre. So back to root causes, a business which employs many, 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 many people and pays them very, 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 very little, and a business that works on labour arbitrage, is likely to have not to be meeting the human rights standards that you would like to see. So immediately one looks at that. And again, in a way, this kind of thinking really helps sourcing people and procurement people, because it's much more about understanding the business model of your supply base. So are we talking labour intensive? Have we moved production to this new place simply because wages are cheaper? Is that company hiring people in from overseas as migrants to do jobs because wages in that country have got too expensive? Those are the risk factors, those are the root causes. So then one can pull those, so identify your risk in that way, and then I would suggest a different sort of audit. So a different sort of audit which puts worker experience at the centre. I suppose the classic on this one is an issue which is exercising a lot of people at the moment, which is forced labour. So audits famous, which is kind of about the worst thing that there can be, right? Audits famously fail to pick up on forced labour. This is because in order to have a finding of forced labour, you have to have triangulation of evidence. So you have to have a person saying, "I am in a condition of forced labour." And nobody ever says that, because it's a very humiliating thing to have to admit. And certainly no one ever says it to an auditor. You then have to have the documentation which shows the kind of list of forced labourers. And then the management have to say, yes, the way we do this is, and explain the condition of forced labour. So it's a very, very, very high burden of proof, a higher burden of proof than you need in a court of law. So your audit will always underreport that worst of labour abuses, forced labour. So how can you spot it? You can spot it by understanding if, for example, you have a vulnerable workforce. So I said if you have a migrant workforce, understanding, for example, how they were recruited, what their journey was to the factory, and whether or not their wage is sufficient for them to be able to, for example, pay back any debt that they might have accumulated, and also keep them in a condition not of forced labour. So it's the turning the cart around and making sure the horse is in front.
I get that. What made me think when you talked about when you fulfill your three conditions that people become more productive, isn't that part of root cause and driving things? Because I remember this challenge in some countries, working hours, and that people work a lot longer than they should. And the question, of course, is why are they doing that?
Exactly, and the answer is usually money. I mean, the clearest example I ever had of that was actually about 12 years ago now in Bangladesh. And in Bangladesh, in the garment industry, famously low wages, famously long working hours, the classic sweatshop. And we were working with a factory, and we realised that workers were incentivized to work very long hours because in the first 8 hours of the day, they earned X an hour, but in any subsequent hours, they earned 2 times X. So obviously, a sensible person would work nice and slowly for the first 8 hours, and then nice and slowly for the next few hours, so as to basically double their wage. So we got one whole line of workers, there were 60 people. We got them in a room and we said, could you, if the materials were available, make what you currently make in 12 hours, in 10 hours, if you were paid the same amount of money? And they said yes, and they went off and they did it the next day, and they did it every subsequent day. And what was fascinating was they then became much more demanding of the management, because they said, well, listen, we can't make it if the material isn't coming through quickly enough from the previous department. And they were much more demanding of each other. They worked much better as teams because they were working together to get home 2 hours earlier for the same money. And of course, the company had a saving of overhead. There was also quality improvement. There was less wastage, etc., etc., etc. So I think we have to look at the incentives. Are we incentivizing people by poverty wages to work very long hours, or are we treating them as adults and saying, listen, this is what we want. We want right first time. We want everything produced according to specification, and we want it by 5 o'clock. How can we do that? Of course, you can only have that conversation, or you can only imagine that conversation is possible if you attribute agency to workers. So if you think workers are capable of having that conversation, you can have that conversation. But as discussed, in many of the contexts in which we work, with the dehumanizing of workers, it's hard to persuade management to engage with workers in that way.
And what would your recommendation be to engage those employers? Because that's then the key, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, we've done a lot of work on the business case. So again, I'll flip to Bangladesh. I mean, the reason for talking about Bangladesh is it's such a kind of concentrated case study of factories all in a very, very close area making similar things. And we did a big study, I think, with 183 factories, where we worked with them on improving productivity, improving quality, hand in hand with improving human resource management. And the business case was quite staggering, actually. And in fact, we then did this work again in India and again in Myanmar, and the results were the same all the way through. In all cases, labour turnover reduced by about a half, and in all cases, efficiency went up by about 33%. In all cases, workers' incomes improved, and in all cases, company profits improved on average across what was actually a sample by the end of about 250 factories. So the business case is very strong. And it's blindingly obvious, isn't it? If you treat people better and incentivize them correctly, then they will do a better job for you and you'll make more money. Interestingly, the business case on its own isn't quite enough. And I think this is where, you talked about social psychology earlier, this is where the psychological and cultural issues come in. And it's also where attention needs to be paid to training and sensitization of floor managers, supervisors, the people who directly manage workers. Because at the moment, I was in a factory once and they said, I said to them, how do you choose who to promote as a supervisor? And they said the one with the loudest voice, because obviously shouting was like the key skill. So there is a huge need to invest in better management skills in the lower rungs of management in order to make the business case stick and in order to get a real change in behaviours. So as ever, I mean, it's in the end, it's not about standards. It's about people. It's about efficiency. And it's about marrying what works for workers with what works for business and finding that sweet spot.
Yeah, I hear you. I took two things out of from what you said. First of all, put the worker's perspective at the center of what you do, and secondly, go for the root cause rather than trying to fulfill some standards. So we seem to making progress in all of this, but unfortunately, now we're being hit by COVID-19, and I guess that makes things a lot more difficult again. Today, we haven't got the time to discuss it in any detail, but and I would like to continue the conversation in the next podcast with you about this. But could you just outline where you see this is moving?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, what we're seeing in the global supply chain is there are kind of two types of effect at the moment, neither of which are good for workers. There's one type of effect, which is in sectors where there is now a complete drought in terms of orders. And the workers in factories and workplaces where there's no social safety net and where orders have been stopped this is a humanitarian crisis in the making. So there the workers are having a very bad time. Then there's another sort of supply chain where they're extremely busy. So this might be in food supply chains, it might be in production of PPE, production of medical equipment, etc., etc. There we also see, in general, higher risk because you have workers who are already fairly exploited being super exploited. So having to work extra hours, not necessarily getting the payment that they need for that, whilst also their freedom of movement is, as indeed as it is for all of us, significantly curtailed. But I would argue it's a bit worse being locked up in a dormitory in Singapore, Malaysia, or China, than it is being locked up in a nice house somewhere in the West. So I think those are what we're seeing as the immediate impacts. Looking slightly longer term, though, I actually do think there might be a correction as a result of COVID, which could be helpful. So this would be that those companies which are treating people as people, which are putting workers at the centre, which are not cutting corners in terms of labour cost, are more likely to be resilient and are more likely to be able to weather the storm. There's emerging evidence on this at the moment, but I think there is just a small bit of hope, which I hope over the next few months will start to manifest.
Thank you, Rosie, for giving us a positive perspective in this very difficult time. I would like to expand on that with you a little bit more in our next conversation, the next podcast, but unfortunately for now, we have to come to an end. And I would like to thank you so much for some really interesting insights in human rights and supply chain. And for our listeners, if you have enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our podcast series or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. Rosie, thank you very much, and speak to you next week.
Thanks, Uwe.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.